Hey Sean, how's it
Sebastian,
going?
great to see you.
You doing fine?
Yes, all
All
is
good?
good. Yeah, thank you for this opportunity.
In political and public communications, leaders use storytelling to connect with voters and build strong relationships through political narrative. Well, we all know that for a story to become alive, the best way is to tell that story. No surprise that podcasting is on the rise across political and public organizations in Europe. Welcome to the European Campaign Playbook, the community of pro-European campaign and communication professionals who are writing the playbook to win campaigns. My name is Sebastian Rodriguez, and I will be your host today. Throughout this month, we will focus on how to start and run your own podcast for your organization. We are doing this in partnership with Bule Media, which is a Brussels-based agency specialized in producing high-quality content, including podcasts. Today, we are interviewing Sean O'Cournin, who is the Secretary General of Renew Europe in the European Committee of the Regions, and most importantly, is the person behind the podcast Letter from Brussels. Welcome to the European Campaign Playbook, Sean. Let's start by getting to know you a little bit better. So, what's your story and how did you end up here at the Committee of the Regions?
Thank you very much, Sebastian, for the invitation. I'm delighted to be with you today to talk about this. And well, I started off as my professional career as a journalist. I studied journalism at the University of Aix-Marseille in southern France, from where I got my first job in journalism in Paris at Radio France International. And after 2 years there, I was able to move to London to work for BBC Television on documentaries. And after 3 years there, I decided I wanted to see politics from the other side. And I ended up working for the Mayor of London, part of the press team. And after 4 years with the Mayor of London, or I should say during the 4 years with the Mayor of London, I also did a master's in European politics while I was working. So the combination of European politics and working for a local government, it brought to my attention, and someone brought to my attention in London, a vacancy in Brussels for the position that I currently have, which is Secretary General of the Liberal political group in the European Committee of the Regions, and I've been here since October 2004. The European Committee of the Regions, I should explain just very briefly, is the EU institution that represents subnational government of the European Union, and it's worth mentioning that there are 1.1 million local and regional elected politicians at the subnational level in the EU 27 member states, and they are collectively responsible for 50% of all the public investments that is carried out at the EU level. So clearly a huge body of democracy with great responsibilities in terms of delivery of public services to the citizens. So the EU's objectives can only be achieved with a really close partnership with subnational government, and it's the European Committee of the Regions that is the bridge between the European level and the subnational level.
And as interesting fact, where do these councillors, the regional ministers mostly come from? From which country?
Well, of the 1.1 million, almost half of them are in France. France has a huge level of, or a huge degree of decentralization at the local level. To a great extent also the regional level, even though in some countries like Spain and Germany, the regions have more power than the French regions. But yeah, half of all those elected, almost half are in France.
So let's start talking about the reason why we are here, and that is the podcast that you yourself produce from your own bedroom, Letter from Brussels. Let's start with the challenges that you were trying to overcome when coming up with this idea and how you address them in the very specific situation, context of the Renew Europe group at the Committee of the Regions?
Yeah. So as I explained, we represent local and regional politicians, and of course our political family, Renew Europe, has thousands of mayors and regional parliamentarians and local councillors. And they are responsible for implementing a lot of the EU policies on the ground. But just like normal citizens, the level of disconnect or the gap in the knowledge with the European level is quite big. You know, they are busy running their cities, running their regions, and what they hear from the European level is usually what they hear or read in their national newspapers and media. And yet they have a very important role to go beyond what comes in the news, to understand not just the summits at which their prime minister participates, but the decisions that are being taken here in their name. So reaching out to that network was what we were trying to solve. How can we reach out to that network? Of course, they receive our emails, but they're very busy politicians. So that was the fundamental thing we were trying to solve, is how can we reach out to this network and connect them with the European level in a different way. And well, my experience as a radio journalist, my communications team's interest made us think, let's do a podcast. But a podcast is there are many different ways of making a podcast. In English, we have this expression, something is as long as a piece of string, or how long is a piece of string. You can have a piece of string like this, or you can have a piece of string like this. So a podcast can be produced in many, many different ways. The only thing that defines a podcast is it's an audio recording that can be downloaded from the internet. So once we decided, okay, we're going to do a podcast, it actually took us a whole year to come up with the concept, because you have to understand who your audience is, what their needs are, what their constraints are, what capacity you have to deliver that. And well, that took us a whole year of thinking of different concepts, researching other podcasts, and in the end, we came up with this model.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, you mentioned research, you mentioned knowing your audience, and definitely for someone or for an organization whose audience represents busy people with not too much time at their hands, a lot of traveling, I suppose, then of course podcast is the best way to reach them, because they can download them on their phones, they can listen to them whilst they are traveling, on a plane, etc. But the thing is, there are way too many podcasts out there. How do you make sure that your audience download yours? Or in other words, what's your original idea about the podcast? Because I found that very, very interesting.
Well, thank you. As I said, it took us a whole year to come up with the concept, and we really wanted to get it right for our target audience. And as you said, we realized immediately that our target audience are busy politicians. So immediately that excluded 2-hour podcasts. No way. And we thought, okay, 15 minutes is perhaps the easiest thing. Maybe when they're driving in the car, in a taxi to the airport, something like that. 15 minutes is a sufficiently short duration for them to listen to, but equally enough to be able to give substance. Of course, it's also a very fragmented audience. There are lots of different languages amongst our target audience, or with any work that's done throughout the European Union. You have to think of all the different languages. Initially, we're focusing in English, which is, after all, the international language. We hope to perhaps introduce other languages, but it is fragmented. So we realize we are focusing to a small percentage or a fraction of our full target audience because we're doing it in English. Now, the message we're trying to give is the work that our members do here in the Committee of the Regions and what we're doing on behalf of the local and regional politicians out there. We wanted to make this as attractive as possible. And one thing that crossed my desk at one time that I was doing some research and exploring this was something called the Trojan Horse by a communications expert called Jonah Berger. Now, the Trojan horse in some fields has a negative connotation, but in this case, he's presenting it in a positive way. And he said, what was the Trojan horse? Trojan horse presented something very beautifully when the inside was different, it was not as beautiful, okay? In this case, he's saying in communication, if you have a message which is maybe dull, maybe a bit boring, but important, and you need to deliver that message, if you can wrap it in an interesting and attractive story, then the audience will retain that message much more easily. So I thought this was a very interesting concept, and I realized that what we could do is, of course, most of our target audience, they will never get the chance to visit Brussels, which is the capital of the Union. Or if they do get a chance to visit it, they won't get to know it well. And Brussels as a city is something which I think is very interesting to our target audience because they are mainly in cities or municipalities and regions, but very much focused on life in cities. So to have an understanding of how the city of Brussels functions, because Brussels is not just the EU institutions, it's a city of 1 million people, could be very interesting. So the podcast tells a story about the city of Brussels at the start, at the end, and in between there's the work that we do in the Committee of the Regions. And I always try to find a connection between that and the story of Brussels, then that's the perfect episode, at least what we're trying to do.
I mean, the moment I heard about this, I started to apply it in everything that I do, and let me tell you that it works. It definitely works. Many people who are following our community, they work in political organizations like Renew Europe Group here in the EU institutions. Maybe they work for NGOs, they might work for advocacy groups, and they might be thinking about starting their own podcast because it is becoming a thing. What advice would you give them before they even start a podcast? What are the best practical advice that you can give to them?
Keep it simple. You mentioned my bedroom. I don't actually do it in my bedroom. I do it in my study at home. I'm fortunate to have just a room just for me where I do my work, and that's where I record it. But absolutely keep it simple to begin with. Mm-hmm. Do your research. As I said, it took me a year between deciding to do a podcast until finally deciding the concept of it. And that meant researching other podcasts, researching the technology to use, the software to use. There's a lot of advice on the internet in different languages. I listened to a podcast for beginners in Spanish, which was fantastic. I read lots of stuff in English. There's stuff out there in all languages. Do that research. Don't spend too much money at the start. It's really not expensive to put together a decent podcast. And then once you've experimented a bit and you see the kind of reaction you're getting, then maybe say after 6 months, you can then, if you're satisfied that this podcast, your podcast, has a life and has a future, then you can invest a little bit more in better software or better equipment. That's what I've done. I bought a new microphone now, a better microphone, because I'm confident now that the feedback that we've been getting after now almost a year means that our podcast does have a future. But I would say, do your research, keep it simple, and for every episode, prepare and prepare, because when you approach your deadline, whatever deadline you have to produce it, I can guarantee you There will be unexpected technical problems. You will find out, or you will discover, that some of the content you were hoping to use is no longer valid, and you need to improvise very quickly. So research, preparation, keep it simple. Start short, or don't be too ambitious. Maybe it's not a question of duration, maybe it's a different question, but don't be too ambitious, because it's always better to deliver more to your audience when you're able to than it is to promise and then not be able to deliver.
Yes, and I would like to pick up on something that you have said, and it's about the content plan, right? So important, because you of course need to, whatever your podcast is about, you'll need to, if you're interviewing someone, then you need to do a lot of preparation to make sure that that person is available, that the time between the interview and, for example, the time when you deliver the podcast is not too long, because maybe the issues you are speaking to, they become less and less relevant. How do you approach the content plan for Letter from Brussels?
So I should backtrack a little bit in terms of other concepts that we considered. We did consider a model where we were interviewing some of our members. The members of the Committee of the Regions are not based in Brussels. So I realized that if I was dependent on a member being present in Brussels, missing the plane, having to cancel their trip to Brussels, or having to connect online with a different sound quality, that was not viable for us. If the people that you're going to interview are based in the same city as you, well, then that's less of a problem. But in our case, that would have been just simply not viable. Too risky. Yes. So we therefore determined that I would write the whole text, and where I needed to quote a member, I would quote the member, because again, for reasons of language, for reasons of preferring not to use the interpreter's voice, also editing reasons, because in 15 minutes, actually, 15 minutes is a long time, but actually it's not a long time. So, it's better that I can, in one sentence, summarize what a member has said than to have an extract which is too long. So in the end, we decided that I would do the writing. Now, in terms of preparation, because I'm writing, it requires me to reserve a number of days to start writing, to rather focus full time on the writing. That's almost impossible to achieve. In effect, what happens is, if I'm starting research and writing a few paragraphs here and there 1 month in advance, I'm already a little bit late.
Okay.
I try to start at least 6 weeks in advance, thinking of the ideas, thinking what the content will be. What I have done in order to make it easier for me in terms of content is to associate the podcast to the plenary of the Committee of the Regions.
Exactly. That's your opportunity to communicate.
That is where that's the highlight, the climax of our policy work. That is where most of our members intervene with speeches, with requests, with questions to European decision makers, European commissioners, MEPs, prime ministers, etc. And so that's where most of my material, of the content, comes for the podcast. So basically, I start preparing 6 weeks ahead of every plenary, and then the episode or the podcast is finished the week after the plenary. Broadly speaking, that's what it is.
So there it is, another piece of advice. Use timing and the opportunities that you have to align your content plan with whatever you are speaking to, because sometimes you, like I said, it's you have to give people something that is relevant, and you know that whatever is going to be discussed at the Committee of the Regions is going to make some news. It's going to be linked to what's happening in the world around us, and that's the opportunity that you have to in a very short period of time, have everything ready, and be able to deliver. One last question that we ask everyone we interview is, and in this case, I am forced to ask this question. What are the podcasts that you listen to and that you recommend our community to subscribe right now?
Well, that's a difficult one in the sense that it actually changes over time. I find myself moving on to other podcasts as I discover. I mean, unfortunately, as I mentioned, one of my favorite ones was in Spanish, so for a lot of the listeners it won't be accessible, but it was, I think it was a brilliant podcast for beginners. And it was a series. The author has stopped it, has the intention of starting again. It's called Podcasting para Principiantes.
We'll make sure we put it on the
Put a link on
the
it.
comments
Yeah.
section.
I think it was really excellent, and for me it was one of my prime resources in terms of helping me come up with the concept and also understanding of what it takes to produce a podcast. The one that I like to listen to a lot has nothing to do with politics. It's
Even
more
better.
about science and philosophy. It's by Sean Carroll, and it's called Mindscape. And that's one that I recommend. And then there are one or two that I listen to quite frequently from the times that I lived in London. They are actually BBC radio programs. But you can find them as podcasts. They have an extended version for the podcast, and one of them is called In Our Time. It's a BBC program about the history of ideas. And then there's another one which is a favorite of mine, which is called Desert Island Discs. They interview people and their preferred music, and it's the story is about what would happen if they were on a desert island and what 8 songs would they like to have. And that music is an excuse to interview the person and get to know them a little bit.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sean. Good luck with your podcast and with the work at Renew Europe, and hope to listen to your next episode very soon.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. A pleasure to be with you.